Hi, everybody. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks so much. We're going to give you just a moment to get settled and join in. We'll be getting started in just a moment with Dean Iyer. We're so excited to have you here. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Hi, Celine.
Hello, Dean Iyer. It's good to have you here. I'm so thrilled.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm going to give a little background for everyone and just give us a little bit of housekeeping before we dive into this incredible conversation with Dean Iyer. So today's conversation is really all around agile leadership in business. And just a few housekeeping before we get started. Today's 12 Months of Leadership is presented by CLOE, the Center for Leadership and Organizational Effectiveness in the School of Management. My name is Celine Krizan, and I will be your MC and host for today's session. I'm a professor of entrepreneurship, and I'm so lucky to work so closely with the CLOE team led by Dorothy Samoa. And on today's call, we have the incredible Maddie. Maddie will be in the chat. She'll be in the Q&A section, helping you get settled. So a few things that you'll see on your screen. So you're in a Zoom webinar today, not a Zoom meeting. So what we're going to ask is for you, if you have any questions throughout today's conversation, is to feel free to click on that Q&A button. And you can drop in questions. We'll save time at the end of today's session for me to kind of bring up your questions, have the opportunity to hear your voices. And without further ado, this is coming up next. So this is our April session, but today's session, we're so thrilled to be having Dean Iyer with us. So I'm going to do a quick intro of Dean Iyer before we jump into our conversation today. Dean Iyer is the H. William Lichtenberger Chair in Management and is the Dean of School of Management since 2022. Dean Iyer has championed several key initiatives, including the business of climate change, business analytics, the social impact of management, and innovation in entrepreneurship and leadership. These academics, programs, experiential learning, conferences, and research projects are really bringing these new perspectives to these key strategic areas. Under Dean Iyer's leadership, the school has launched several new degree programs, including an online MBA, an MS in Business Analytics, and an MS in Management for non-business majors, and an MS in Supply Chain Management with even more underway. He's also led the creation of 3 new centers: AI in Business Innovation, Marketing Analysis, and Supply Chain Analysis. These really bridge academia and industry, and the school's Behavioral Research Lab, which helps uncover human insights into human behavior with edge-cutting neuromarketing tools. With Dean Iyer's support, the school's Project Clinic employs student interns who partner with companies to solve real-world problems and create a positive change. He's also a key collaborator in UB's involvements in New York Smart I-Corridor Tech Hub. It's a $40 million initiative to grow the semiconductor manufacturing, research, and education across New York State. He's a highly accomplished scholar, and today's session is going to really highlight and help us have a really thoughtful conversation around agile leadership in business. So without further ado, Dean Iyer, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Celine. Wonderful to be here.
So here's where we want to start. So you have incredible background in research across academia. And what we want you to really start us off with is, how do you define agile leadership? And how has this perspective evolved throughout your career in academia and supply chain management?
So first, thank you for the opportunity to chat with all our attendees and to supporters of CLOE. The word agile just means that you respect the market. And the market in the educational world is really a market for ideas. So there is the demand side of the market, which is really companies and perhaps companies and institutions, government institutions and others. And the supply comes from the faculty and the students who are at the university. So my respect for Agile is really my role first as a teacher. So when you're in a classroom, the question is, do you present material that you came ready to tell everybody about, or do you convince the students in front of you that you're there to make their careers more successful? So one of the things I always tell my students whenever I teach a class is, you have the right to raise your hand and ask me, why am I learning this? And it's my responsibility to answer to you why you're learning it. This really is the need to be agile, to be allowing students to ask you questions during a class that you can make the case for. So this meeting of, in my field, we say, make supply meet demand. That's Agile. So that's what happens in the classroom. But the same thing happens in the research world. So my own training is really as an engineer. I've spent all my lives getting all my degrees in engineering schools. And in my PhD was in industrial and systems engineering. And that area of engineering is really embedded in companies in looking at their processes, learning from them, creating mathematical abstractions and going back to the companies. So a lot of my research was really driven by a context. And again, just as an anecdote, I've told all my PhD students, if it's true in general, it's true in at least one case. Could you give me that one case where it's true? And the reason this is useful is that there has to be some place where you can ground your research. And so to me, that's what Agile means, getting both sides of the equation as to who needs it, who's going to do the work to get them to match. And a lot of the decision-making can really be framed that way, saying, why are we doing this? Who is the customer? Who is the supplier? What demand signals can be fed back to the person who's delivering the service? And what ideas on the supply side can be fed back to the market? And that's really a long-winded way of describing Agile the way I come from.
Well, that really sets up the conversation in a really incredible way. And I know something you've talked a lot about and that we've had conversations on are the biggest challenges that business leaders are going to face in navigating not only uncertainty, but also the integration and the disruption of AI. So, how do you see AI and business analytics playing a role in possibly maybe enhancing agility?
So at the outset, one way I like to think of a problem is if you expand the pie, there's the potential that all participants get more pie. That's sort of, if you have that mindset, then a way to sort of think about it is, rather than having a zero-sum mentality, how are we going to divvy it up? The first question is, can we expand the pie? And that's probably relevant in AI as well as everything else. So again, I hate to go back to being a professor, but how do you expand the pie? So in most contexts, there probably are a whole bunch of stakeholders who are involved over the life cycle of a product or a service or a person's education journey. And each person or each participant is doing the best they can. There's always more to be done through coordination. And so the way the pie expands is through coordination. So coordination is really the extra that's left on the table because people haven't talked to each other and streamlined. So that's sort of the mindset to think about. I really think AI can be thought of as enabling improved coordination. I think if we can use that mindset, we don't need to think about all the jobs that will go away. We can think about all the things that people can do better, all the value creation that can increase. And when value creation increases, resources provided in terms of salaries will increase. So a way for everybody to be thinking about the problem, even from a leadership perspective, is how do we enable the pie to expand? And how do we enable all of the participants to find a way to participate in this expanded pie? And I think a lot of what we're trying to think about is in that space. So that's one side of the question. If you think about it specifically in the area of education, one of my executive students from a long time ago said, give me one sentence of something you want to do that AI will help you. So here's my framing, one sentence framing. What I'd love to do is to do personalization of education at scale. That's my value proposition. So what does that mean? Every student in the classroom comes to that classroom being very good at a few things, and wanting to know, deficient in some other things. But they're different across all the students in the classroom. And yet the faculty member has one shot to give a lecture. Well, the student takes that lecture and goes back and says, well, I don't understand this. How do they get help? They're to show up in this faculty member's office hours and ask a question or ask a friend. Well, how can AI mediate? What if all the content in the classroom is available and the students can ask questions in plain English that's answered based on the material in the classroom? The faculty member gets to see all the questions being answered and intervenes and provides some joint broadcasts. This way, each student is asking their questions and getting an answer. Even if they decide it's 2 o'clock in the morning where they ask a question, there is somebody available. Well, this is the start of providing personalized education at scale. Here's my hypothesis. That will expand the pie. That will increase the students engaged in education. That would increase the services we can provide. To me, that's an example of how AI can help in the education.
And Dean, I think that's such a critical point. In teaching entrepreneurship, I have my students think of AI as a co-founder. When I'm doing these sessions and we're talking about AI, I think there's fear around it. But if you think about it as increasing the pie, it reduces that fear and also encourages collaboration, makes us more productive, makes us more effective. So I love that perspective.
Thank you.
So the next question that really built on what we just were talking about. And something that you've mentioned is that organizations can view their assets as real options, or really as investments for the short and long term that can be leveraged. Can you dig into that perspective and maybe share an example, either in the supply chain aspect of Agile leadership or the business school perspective of how we can apply this perspective to our decision making?
So the just in terms of definition, the idea of a real option is that you think about not optimizing for what the problem as it exists today, but positioning yourself for the problems today and the problems tomorrow. So one way to think about education is really a real option, because what you're taught in the classroom is ways to think about a problem. Very often you say, am I perfectly positioned for the first job I take? No, you're perfectly positioned for all jobs you take. So that's an example of a real option. So what it really means is for us as a school and for all our students to really think about not just today, but today and in the future. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that we really need to dig into conceptual tools that'll help us think about problems that we don't even know will face our students. And that requires them to be grounded in some basics, to be grounded in the tools, but also to learn how to apply the tools. So that is the challenge from an education perspective. From an institutional perspective, you mentioned that as a school, we're trying to have more centers, more faculty, et cetera, and these project clinics that connect us with companies. The goal with all of that is to position us as a school to be ready to provide services and training across a variety of options, across a variety of contexts. So this really, for many of our audience who are interested in finance you have a portfolio. What does a portfolio do? A portfolio effectively hedges against risk. And what does the word hedging against risk mean? Well, if one portion of your portfolio is growing and the other portion, you adjust the portfolio so that the overall risk is managed. So the same is true with us. By having a variety of areas, we don't know which area is going to be a growth area or not a growth area. At the back end, we can adjust and respond to the market, very much the way I talked about in terms of getting supply to meet demand. So that's really the agility, and that's the idea of a real option. The real option gets to be exercised when you adjust the way you organize to respond to the requirements. But the real option comes from having people who can offer that adjustment. So by having people who can adjust, that's where the real option comes in. So we are trying to attract leaders and attract faculty who can actually be comfortable both with doing research as well as interacting with companies. That's how we buy the real option for ourselves, by getting those leaders into our fold, because they are the people who will say, oh, I understand this problem. I know exactly what to do with it. As long as we have a bunch of people who have that capability, we can then say, we will adjust dynamically to whatever is thrown at us. So that is the one thing that leaders can do. Ensure that you have enough real options, which means you can adjust your portfolio to respond to industry needs.
Now, this next question is a bit of a bigger question, and I know you've written over 5 books and have had 50 plus articles. So, question specifically on your research. So, can you provide us some insight, just a few key takeaways from your research in operations and supply chain management that business leaders can apply when they're managing uncertainty or when they're managing in an agile leadership style?
So I want to, research, it's easier to explain when you focus on the specifics. So let me focus on a couple of examples. So one example really came from a case I wrote a long time ago. And actually, it turned out, just coincidentally, my PhD student at the time, who's now a tenured faculty member here at UB, Aditya Vedantam, I'd explained this case to him. So this case really was a glass manufacturing company in Indiana. And they were basically saying that they needed cullet, which is broken glass, used glass. And it turns out that if you start with used glass, the cost to produce new glass drops to 20% of if you start with sand and try to melt it. Because when you start with glass, the heat to melt it is a lot lower than when you start with sand. So this was the simple thing. But then the challenge was, despite the fact that there was this amazing demand for used glass, it was very difficult to get used glass in Indiana. Why? Because Indiana did not have a bottle bill. And the bottle bill is here in New York, you have a bottle bill. So one of the questions that came up is, how do we create voluntary compliance for companies using used glass, with the idea being that if there is a market for used glass, more people would recycle because those demand signals will travel to the customers. The customers could even get paid for the glass, or the municipalities could get paid for the glass, and then we would have a system in place. So we started thinking about this issue and then created research which was trying to understand how the capability to collect and recycle glass impacts the availability and the market for glass, and therefore impacts the products that will make claims regarding recycled content. Anybody who's gone to Starbucks and picked up a Starbucks cup, you'll see the percent recycled content in the cup, you'll see percent recycled content in the sleeve, etc. So you say, why are they telling customers about the percent recycled content? We basically said customers who care about the recycled content will be more likely to go to Starbucks. So there's a tiny demand benefit associated with the recycled content that's required to create an overall market. And part of what we did is empirically calculated those values. It turned out in. So that's an example of a piece of research that started with a company, then converted into a bunch of math, then converted into data, and then converted to policy recommendations as to what should policymakers do to create a market in this context. So that's one example. Another example is, for 10 years, we worked with the US Coast Guard. And the problem arose because I had students in my class who were from the Coast Guard. And one of them said, I just took your class. I manage a base. I spend a lot of money. I manage operations. We don't use anything that you taught us. So why don't we do the following? We'll invite you to the base and you tell us what we should do. So we visited the base in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. And when we visited the base, I said, before going to the base, could you give us some data, a month of data of everything you do? And so we had analyzed the data, a colleague of mine who's currently at UNC, Vinayak Deshpande. And so we analyzed the data and he said, could you tell us a bunch of things you believe to be true? And all we want to do is to test that in your data. So they told us 2 or 3 things. We tested in the data, none of which was true. So then I said, what do you mean it's not true? It couldn't be. I said, the data tells you what it is. And the value proposition is that we will connect ideas you have with the data. So what started with that conversation ended up being 10 years of collaboration. And during that period, we and our students served as the analysts for the US Coast Guard. For 10 years, or any questions they had, they would ask us, we would do the analysis. And then we had to decide, what does success mean? So success for us is writing papers. But in our field, there's something called the Edelman Prize. And I said, success means we apply for the Edelman Prize. So that's what we did at the end of 10 years. We did not win the prize, but we were the runner-up. And so the award that was obtained, we donated it to the Coast Guard Officers Fund. So what benefited is that this is a video created by the Coast Guard Commandant working with us, telling the world about their application and reporting to Congress, this is what they did. So this is an example of an application where all the questions came from the context. All the research benefited students and supported students and also supported the Coast Guard. It was very satisfying. So to me, those are examples of how research and practice intertwine. And my own impression is that great research and great applications are really the same thing. They're elegant,
Yes,
easy to communicate, and they have a value proposition that can be validated. It's not a black box. It's very clear where the values come. So that's a short example. I can give you many, many more examples, but these are a couple of examples.
so, Dina, we just had a wonderful question come in from one of our alums. So, Fernando asks, I earned my MBA from UB 32 years ago, where I was trained to be a risk manager. Given the rapidly changing business landscape, how is today's education at UB equipping students to navigate uncertainty and effectively manage ambiguity?
So first, it's absolutely, I agree 100% that managing uncertainty is key. And the way the classroom is changing is to decrease the number of contexts where everything is provided in the question, and all you have to do is to crank things. More and more of the teaching involves cases and open-ended cases that require students to acquire the information to ask a question. This is to deal with the ambiguity in problem framing. It's also the case that many more of the projects, most of the graduate school things, as well as undergraduate programs, requires capstone projects. For those capstone projects, students have to go out and collect the data, and that's really requires them to understand that there might be uncertainty, the numbers might change over time, etc. A bigger question, which we're trying to incorporate right now, goes back to Salim's earlier question regarding technology changes. I was at a conference, a dean's conference a few weeks ago, and one of the speakers basically said, well, there were 600 deans in the audience, and he challenged us. He said, if you don't set aside a half an hour each week to try out the AI tools to see what you would do differently, you are behind. So I've committed to spend not half an hour or 1 hour, potentially up to 10 hours a week to figure out how I would change what I do incorporating AI tools. So this is one of the ways to manage risk is to be in this continuous learning mode. And learning mode is really jumping in, not just reading, but trying out new tools. I'll give you an example of a tool. There were a lot of things involving Excel that we do. One of our challenges is to position ourselves so that the classes we offer and the mix of classes respond to market needs. So a lot of it was all kinds of pivots and modeling, etc. And then I said, well, can I use, in this case, a Google tool, Gemini Pro, to interact with my spreadsheet, to merge spreadsheets. And I realized that I literally, with carefully written sentences, I could get all the results I could get with Excel. So now I've shifted to using Gemini Pro to do all my analysis for spreadsheets. I'm not going to use pivot tables. I'm going to validate it. I'm going to get all the graphs, all the analysis, everything. Well, to me, that's another way to manage the risk in the future. So bottom line, get students to embrace ambiguity by going out and gathering the right data. Get them to decrease their worries about tools by jumping in and trying them. The good news is, while you're at a university, you're not breaking anything. So this is your sandbox to try things. For us, the capstone projects are a great way for students to really try these tools and learn about them. So I'm hoping that positions our students to be ready to embrace a world with risk.
So Dean and I, we're almost at time, but just do you have one quick piece of advice for us for how we can really bring Agile leadership to life?
A key idea in Agile leadership is, first, I may have not mentioned this enough, but one of the most important sources of agility is really the people in the organization. So investing in recognizing people for the leadership they provide is absolutely, absolutely crucial, but also investing in them as they acquire the skills. To me, it's all the people in the organization who really, and their commitment to its success, who really are the people who help you increase the pie and who help you frame things in a manner that is far more positive and ensures that there's participation. So to me, don't forget the people and don't forget pie expansion. And that will get you to see to it that you've invested in the real options to be successful as an Agile leader.
Well, thank you, Dean Iyer. I think that's a perfect place to end it. Thank you for your leadership and your time today. We're so grateful that you were able to join us.
Thank you, Celine, and thank you to all of you who participated.
And just to wrap us up before you go, thank you for spending your lunch hour with us. We are committed to bringing you these insights, these thought leadership pieces, and you'll see our next opportunity where we will be back together is our next Monday, April 7th. We'll be with Scott Beeler. Scott Beeler will be here with us talking about lessons on servant leadership, and he has been recognized as the Executive of the Year by the university. So we're so excited to have Scott with us and to be able to share some of his insights. And finally, please register for that opportunity so you can scan this QR code now. And our final ask and takeaway for you is to get involved with CLOE. So find this opportunity. We have some really fantastic programs and events coming up. The first of which is our Leadership Now conference that is happening on April 23rd at the Buffalo Niagara Marriott. It's going to be a full day conference, tons of thought leadership, tons of talks. It's a really great opportunity to get involved with CLOE and to hear from some incredible thought leaders in this community. There's also our coaching leadership certification, our learning accelerator program. You can register for any upcoming open houses or connect with the CLOE team. So thank you for taking your time to be with us today. Thank you to the CLOE team. Thank you to Maddie and Dorothy for having us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your Monday. Thank you for coming to our 12 months of leadership.